October 15th, 1944. The coastal French town of Port-en-Bessin. A small convoy of American military trucks rumbled down a winding coastal road toward the newly constructed harbour facilities. In the back of the lead vehicle, a group of 20 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their faces grim masks of exhaustion and defeat. They were being transferred from a temporary holding camp to assist with dock operations, a common practice for POWs with technical skills. None of them knew that what awaited them around the next bend would shatter every assumption they had about the war they'd been fighting. None realized they were about to confront a sight that would break hardened soldiers to tears and reveal the mathematical impossibility of German victory more clearly than any battle or campaign. Hauptmann Friedrich Weller, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, sat nearest the tailgate. His uniform, once immaculate, now hung loosely on his frame after months of diminishing rations on the front lines before his capture at Saint-Lô. As a tank commander educated as an industrial engineer before the war, Weller had been selected for this work detail specifically because of his logistical knowledge. Next to him sat Werner Klemperer, once a supply officer for the Wehrmacht, and Karl Arndt, a former U-boat commander who had survived his vessel's sinking off the Normandy coast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck rounded the final curve in the road, and the harbour came into view. The prisoners' conversation died instantly. For several seconds, not one of the 20 men spoke or moved. They simply stared, their minds struggling to process the scale of what spread before them. Port-en-Bessin had been a modest fishing harbour before the war. Now it stretched for miles in either direction, an artificial wonder constructed in sections back in America, towed across the Atlantic and assembled off the Norman coast. And it teemed with activity that defied comprehension. Liberty ships, dozens upon dozens of them, stretched to the horizon, their massive hulls disgorging endless streams of supplies. Massive cranes swung crates from ship to shore in a perpetual motion. Thousands of trucks moved in organized chaos, loading, unloading, departing inland. Mountains of supplies rose like new geography. Ammunition crates stacked higher than buildings, fuel drums arranged in perfect grids that covered acres, ration boxes creating artificial hills. Mein Gott, Weller whispered, the words escaping involuntarily. Das ist nicht möglich. But it was possible. It was real. It was American industrial might made manifest before their eyes. 5 million tons of supplies flowing through a harbour that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Later that evening, after a day of assisting with dock operations that had left them physically exhausted but mentally reeling, the German prisoners gathered in their temporary barracks. The American guards, noticing their stunned silence throughout the day, had given them space. The psychological impact of what they'd witnessed was evident even to men who couldn't understand their muttered German conversations. "Did you see the fuel depot?" Klemperer asked, his voice hollow. "I counted over 200,000 drums. Do you know how much fuel that is?" He didn't wait for an answer. "More than the entire Wehrmacht Eastern Front receives in a month, and that's just one depot, at one harbour." Weller nodded slowly. "I was responsible for fuel allocation for our entire panzer regiment. We measured our supplies in litres and planned operations around strict rationing. They measure in oceans." Arndt, the U-boat commander, sat on his bunk with his head in his hands. "We were told we were winning the Battle of the Atlantic, that our U-boats were strangling their supply lines." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "We believed we were starving the Allied war machine. All those patrols, all those men lost." His voice broke. "For what?" "To slow this." "Flood," Weller supplied quietly. "An unstoppable flood." The journey that had brought these men to this moment of devastating clarity began years earlier, with fundamental miscalculations about American industrial potential. Like most Germans, they had absorbed their leadership's assessment of America, a nation of soft consumers, capable of producing luxury automobiles and refrigerators, but lacking the industrial discipline for serious warfare. Weller had participated in staff briefings where intelligence reports of Roosevelt's production goals announced in 1940 50,000 aircraft annually, 45,000 tanks, millions of tons of shipping were dismissed as laughable propaganda. The numbers seemed fantastical, impossible by any industrial standard Germany understood. America is not a warrior nation, his commanding general had explained confidently. They make soft consumer goods. Their factories produce chrome-laden automobiles and household appliances. They cannot convert to military production with any efficiency. This assessment had seemed reasonable based on pre-war data. In 1939, America produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. Their army ranked 18th globally, behind Romania. Their tanks were outdated designs, few in number. How could such a nation increase production 50-fold in just 2 years? What the German intelligence services failed to understand, what Weller and his fellow prisoners now confronted with brutal clarity, was how the Great Depression had created an industrial sleeping giant. Factories sat idle or underutilized across the United States. Millions of skilled workers remained unemployed. Machine tools that could produce automobiles could just as easily produce tanks. What appeared as economic weakness was actually enormous reserve capacity waiting to be activated. The Americans weren't building an industrial base from scratch, they were reactivating dormant capacity that already existed. For most of the men in the barracks that night, the harbor had been their first direct encounter with American logistics. But for Weller, it represented confirmation of disturbing patterns he'd observed since the Normandy landings. As a panzer commander, he had witnessed American replacement rates firsthand. German units that achieved tactical victories found themselves facing fully re-equipped American formations within days. Tanks destroyed on Monday were replaced by Wednesday. Artillery ammunition flowed in quantities that German gunners could scarcely imagine. Every American infantry squad had more automatic weapons than a German platoon. Every American division had more trucks than a German corps. I once captured an American supply dump during a counterattack near Caen, Weller told the others, his voice distant with the memory. It contained more rations, ammunition, and fuel than my entire regiment had, and this wasn't their main depot, just a forward supply point for a single battalion. He paused, remembering the moment when realization had first dawned. Their battalion supply officer was among the prisoners we took. I interrogated him myself. I asked about their supply situation, expecting to hear complaints about shortages, about rationing the same problems we faced daily. He laughed. Weller's face tightened at the memory. He actually laughed and said, "Buddy, we throw away more than you guys ever see." That night, the first of many they would spend working at the harbor, several of the German prisoners wept quietly in their bunks. Their tears weren't for their capture or their defeated nation. They wept for the mathematical certainty of German defeat that the harbor represented. They wept for the futility of their sacrifice, for comrades lost in a war that industrial production numbers had decided long before any tactical genius could matter. The following morning brought further revelations as they returned to the harbor. An American lieutenant, a young man named Barnes, who spoke passable German, had been assigned to supervise their work detail. Noticing their continued shock at the scale of operations, he engaged them with surprising frankness. "You boys thought you were winning, didn't you?" he asked during a brief break, offering them cigarettes American brands, abundant and freely shared. "I don't blame you. Your tanks were better, your tactics too. For a while." Weller accepted a cigarette with a nod of thanks. "Our intelligence reports," he began, then stopped himself. What was the point now? Barnes smiled without malice. "Let me show you something." He led them to a nearby administrative building and pointed to a wall chart tracking supply throughput. The numbers were displayed openly, no secrecy whatsoever. Why bother hiding what was too enormous to conceal? "Yesterday," Barnes explained, tapping the most recent column, "this harbour processed 26,000 tons of supplies. That's just one day, gentlemen. One harbour of many. A year ago, this was an empty coastline." Klemperer studied the chart with professional interest. As a former Wehrmacht supply officer, He understood better than most what the numbers represented. "These figures," he said quietly, "they cannot be correct." Barnes shrugged. "Numbers don't lie, Captain. In fact, they're about to get bigger. See this projection for next month? We're expanding operations again." The American's casual confidence, his matter-of-fact acceptance of what seemed miraculous to the Germans, perhaps revealed more than any statistic. This wasn't exceptional to him. This was normal American operations. Later that day, Weller found himself assisting with the unloading of a Liberty ship carrying replacement vehicles. Brand new trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks rolled down the ramps in an unending stream. As a tank commander, he naturally gravitated toward a line of Sherman tanks being offloaded from another vessel. "Fresh from the factory," explained the American sergeant supervising the operation. "Still have that new tank smell." "How many?" Weller couldn't help asking. "This shipment? 143 Shermans, plus parts for another 60 being assembled at the repair depot." The sergeant gestured toward a massive facility further down the harbour, where damaged vehicles disappeared in one end and emerged repaired from the other, like some industrial digestive system. "We get shipments like this every 3 days. Weller did the mental calculation and felt physically ill. His entire Panzer regiment had operated with fewer tanks than this single shipment. Germany's total monthly tank production in 1944 barely exceeded what this one harbour received in a week. "They're not as good as your Tigers," the sergeant continued conversationally, misinterpreting Weller's silence as professional critique. "But when we can build 10 Shermans for every Tiger and replace them faster than you can knock 'em out." He left the arithmetic unspoken. That night, the German prisoners held an impromptu council in their barracks. The Americans made no attempt to eavesdrop or restrict their conversations. Why would they? The reality of Allied production advantage was displayed openly across the harbour. No secret could be more devastating than what they witnessed daily with their own eyes. "We must calculate precisely what we are seeing," Weller suggested, his engineer's mind seeking the comfort of exact figures. "We need to understand the scale." For hours, they pooled their observations, comparing American supply volumes to their Wehrmacht equivalents. Klemperer's experience as a supply officer proved invaluable. He had memorized the standard supply requirements for German divisions and corps, giving them a baseline for comparison. The figures they arrived at seemed fantastical, yet each man had witnessed the evidence personally. The harbour processed daily. Ammunition, 8,000 tons, more than a German infantry division received monthly. 500,000 gallons, equivalent to the entire weekly allocation for Army Group West rations. Food for 900,000 men, with variety and abundance that German soldiers hadn't seen since the early war years. Vehicles, 200 to 300 new and repaired exceeding monthly replacements for entire German army groups. Medical supplies, more sulfur, drugs, plasma, and bandages than were available in all of occupied France. With these supply levels, Klemperer concluded, his voice flat with the certainty of professional assessment, American forces can sustain offensive operations indefinitely. They can replace all losses, maintain full ammunition expenditure rates, and operate all vehicles without conservation measures. While we count every shell, measure fuel in litres, and cannot replace lost tanks, Arndt added bitterly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the days passed, their work provided access to more areas of the harbour, each revealing new aspects of American logistical dominance. Most shocking was the attitude toward equipment, maintenance, and replacement. Where German forces repaired everything, scavenged parts, and kept vehicles running through increasingly desperate improvisation, the Americans often discarded equipment with minor damage. "Why are these being scrapped?" Weller asked an American mechanic, pointing to a line of jeeps with seemingly minimal damage. "They could be repaired," the mechanic shrugged. "Not worth the time. Cheaper and faster to requisition new ones than tie up mechanics with minor repairs." Such wastefulness would have been criminal in the Wehrmacht. Here, it was standard procedure. a reflection of production capacity so vast that conservation seemed unnecessary. One afternoon, Weller found himself assisting with the organization of a massive ammunition depot. The American officer supervising them, a Captain Miller, noticed his expression as they surveyed the endless rows of artillery shells. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" Miller asked. Weller nodded cautiously. "In Germany, we measure artillery shells by the piece. Here, you count by the ton. You know what the funny thing is?" Miller replied. "Back home, they're frustrated by production shortfalls. The factories aren't meeting their quotas." The statement hit Weller like a physical blow. This abundance, this unimaginable ocean of material represented production below American expectations? "That cannot be possible," he said, forgetting himself. Miller pulled a newspaper from his pocket and handed it to Weller. "Here, see for yourself, yesterday's Stars and Stripes." The front-page article detailed congressional hearings about disappointing production figures for the third quarter of 1944. American factories had produced only 23,000 aircraft, 6,000 tanks, and 53,000 trucks, all below projected targets. The figures exceeded total German annual production, yet to Americans, they represented failure. During dinner that evening, the German prisoners discussed their observations in subdued tones. The shock had given way to a deeper, more profound despair. Not the raw emotional breakdown of their first night, but something colder and more calculated. The acceptance of mathematical certainty. "It was never about tactics or courage or leadership," Weller said, the words drawn from him reluctantly. "It was always about factories and raw materials and production capacity." "But our victories in 39 and 40, Arndt objected. "Poland, France, Norway, we conquered half of Europe." "Tactical victories," Klemperer replied. "Brilliant operations, yes, but they led Germany to fight enemies with 5 times our industrial capacity. The moment America entered the war, the mathematical outcome was fixed." "You sound like a defeatist," one of the younger prisoners muttered. Weller shook his head. "Mathematics isn't defeatism. It's reality. Germany conquered territories but never fully mobilized their industrial capacity. America had dormant factories ready to activate. The numbers were always against us." "Then why did they lie to us?" The question came from a young Wehrmacht private who couldn't have been more than 19. Why did they tell us we were winning? A heavy silence fell over the group. Finally, Arndt answered, "Because admitting the truth meant accepting defeat, and that was unthinkable." The young private's question haunted Weller that night. Why had Germany's leadership maintained the fiction of possible victory when production figures made the outcome mathematically inevitable? Why had they sacrificed millions of lives fighting against arithmetic itself? The answer lay partly in ideology. Nazi racial theory couldn't accept that inferior Americans could outproduce the German master race. But it also reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about modern industrial warfare. Germany's military tradition emphasized tactical brilliance, courage, leadership, and fighting spirit. These qualities had decided wars for centuries, but World War II was different. It was the first truly global industrial war, where victory depended more on factory output than battlefield heroism. A nation that could produce more tanks, planes, and ships would win through simple attrition, regardless of the tactical situation. The following day brought Weller face to face with perhaps the most symbolic representation of American industrial might, a Liberty ship being unloaded at the far end of the harbor. These vessels, produced in American shipyards with revolutionary efficiency, represented everything Germany had failed to understand about their enemy. Lieutenant Barnes, noticing Weller's interest, offered information without, prompting, "That's the SS Robert Sherrod, keel laid down 88 days ago in Baltimore, from raw materials to completed ocean-going vessel in under 3 months." Weller, who had studied industrial engineering before the war, knew this should be impossible. Shipbuilding was a painstaking process requiring skilled labor and time, yet here floated the evidence. "How is this possible?" he asked, professional curiosity overcoming his situation. "Mass production, prefabrication, welding instead of riveting, Barnes explained. We broke shipbuilding down into an assembly line process. Different yards specialized in different sections, bow, stern, midsection, built simultaneously, then brought together for final assembly. And how many has America built? Liberty ships. We're approaching 3,000 now, plus hundreds of other vessel types. Weller recalled desperate U-boat radio transmissions he'd heard before his capture, commanders reporting increasingly futile patrol results. The German naval strategy had depended on sinking ships faster than they could be built. With Liberty ships being completed at the rate of one per day, that strategy had been doomed from inception. That night, Weller sat alone on his bunk long after the others had fallen asleep. In his hand, he held his Iron Cross First Class, awarded for actions on the Eastern Front in 1943. He had been so proud when the medal was pinned to his chest, believing he was contributing to final victory. Now he understood the bitter truth. No individual heroism, no tactical brilliance, no technological advantage could overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. Germany had lost the war before the first shot was fired, not through any moral failing or lack of courage, but through the cold, implacable reality of production statistics. As October turned to November, the German prisoners continued their work at the harbour, witnessing the unending flow of American abundance. Some found a strange comfort in this mathematical certainty. Their defeat wasn't due to personal failure or lack of fighting spirit. They had been defeated by industrial capacity, by America's ability to drown them in material abundance. There was no shame in losing to arithmetic. For Weller, however, the revelation brought no comfort, only growing anger not at the Americans, but at his own leadership. How many lives might have been saved if Germany had recognized reality sooner? How many cities might have been spared destruction if the regime had acknowledged the impossible odds? The sight of 5 million tons of supplies flowing through a single harbour had broken these men, not through humiliation, but through the clarity it provided. They wept not from shame, but from the realization that millions had died in a cause that production statistics had decided long before. Lieutenant Barnes found Weller one evening, staring out at the harbour lights reflecting off the dark water. The endless activity continued around the clock, 3 shifts of workers ensuring the material flow never paused. You know, Barnes said conversationally, I studied engineering too, before the war, at MIT. Weller nodded without surprise. The American had shown technical knowledge in their previous conversations. Then you understand what I've realized, Weller replied. This war wasn't decided by battles or campaigns, it was decided by productive capacity. That's the American way of war, Barnes agreed. We're not naturally militaristic, but once committed, we bring our real strength to bear, our factories, our resources, our ability to build in quantities that overwhelm any quality advantage. And now? Weller asked, gesturing toward the ceaseless activity before them. Now we're building what comes after, Barnes said. The same capacity that built all this can rebuild Europe. The same ships carrying tanks today will carry food and building materials tomorrow. For the first time since his capture, Weller felt a flicker of hope not for Germany's war effort, which he now knew had been doomed from the start, but for what might follow. If America could build Liberty ships and Sherman tanks with such efficiency, perhaps they could help rebuild a shattered continent with equal determination. The tears shed by German POWs when they first witnessed American abundance represented more than defeat. They marked the end of one understanding of warfare and the beginning of another. In that harbour, watching 5 million tons of supplies flow endlessly from ship to shore, these men confronted the industrial reality that had made their sacrifice futile, and perhaps, in that bitter knowledge, lay the seeds of a different future. As winter settled over Port-en-Bessin in late November 1944, the harbour's activity intensified rather than diminished. The German prisoners watched in continued amazement as the Americans confronted the challenges of the European winter with the same overwhelming force they applied to military operations. Massive heated tents appeared overnight to shelter sensitive operations. Specialized winter equipment arrived by the shipload: cold weather gear, anti-freeze compounds, winterized vehicles. For the Wehrmacht veterans, Winter had always meant a slowing of operations, a time when shortages became more acute and logistics more difficult. Yet here, the Americans seemed to accelerate, stockpiling for offensives to come. They're preparing for a major winter offensive, Klemperer observed one morning as they watched endless columns of supplies moving inland. His experience as a supply officer made his assessment authoritative. The volume indicates planning for sustained high-intensity operations. 3. Possibly 4 months without resupply from their continental bases. Impossible, another prisoner objected. No army can stockpile for operations of that duration. No German army, Weller corrected quietly. But we're not measuring by German standards anymore. The scale had become almost numbing. In their weeks at the harbour, the prisoners had developed a new frame of reference, what they called American normal, a standard of abundance that made their previous understanding of military logistics seem like children playing at war. One morning in early December, Lieutenant Barnes approached their work detail with new instructions. "We're being visited by some brass from Washington," he explained. "General Somerville from the Army Service Forces. They want to show him our operation, including how we're utilizing prisoner labor. You'll be working at the vehicle depot today." The vehicle depot occupied nearly a square mile at the harbor's eastern edge. Here, fresh vehicles were processed, prepped for service, and dispatched to combat units. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking, an automotive production line in reverse, with finished vehicles arriving by the shipload and being prepared for immediate combat operations. General Somerville's inspection tour reached the vehicle depot shortly before noon. He was a compact, energetic man with a businessman's demeanor rather than a traditional military bearing. The general's entourage included several civilian men in expensive suits, executives from automotive companies on government contracts, as Weller would later learn. As the inspection party approached, Weller and his fellow prisoners stiffened instinctively. Years of military discipline didn't disappear with capture. Barnes had instructed them to continue working but to be respectful if addressed directly. To Weller's surprise, General Somerville stopped directly in front of their group. "These are some of your German POWs?" he asked the accompanying colonel. "Yes, sir. Technical specialists, mostly. Engineers, mechanics, logistics officers." The general studied them with professional rather than personal interest. "Any of them speak English well?" Barnes stepped forward. "Hauptmann? Weller does, sir. He was an industrial engineer before the war." The general turned to Weller. "Captain, what's your assessment of our operation here?" The directness of the question caught Weller off guard. He hesitated, glancing at Barnes, who nodded slightly. "It is." Weller searched for words that could convey the magnitude without seeming sycophantic. "It is beyond anything we believed possible, General. The scale exceeds our intelligence estimates by factors of 5 to 10. The general nodded, seemingly pleased with the honest assessment. "That's because your intelligence services never understood American industry. They looked at our production figures from 1939 and projected linear growth. What they missed was our excess capacity." He turned to one of the civilian executives. "Tell him, Roger." The man stepped forward. "I'm from Ford Motor Company. Before the war, we built cars. Now we build tanks, engines, trucks, same factories, same workers, different products. But here's what your analysts missed. During the Depression, we were operating at 30% capacity. Most of our production lines sat idle. When war came, we didn't need to build new factories, we just activated what was already there." Weller nodded slowly. "Our analysts assumed any industrial conversion would require years of preparation, new facilities, training of workers." "Exactly wrong," the general interjected. "Our automotive engineers already knew how to design and build sophisticated machinery. Our factory workers already understood assembly line production. Our chemical companies already had research capabilities for explosives and synthetic materials. We didn't start from zero, we started from 30% and ramped up to 100%. The conversation was surreal. A German PO discussing industrial capacity with an American general as if they were colleagues rather than enemies. Yet Weller recognized that the general's purpose wasn't to humiliate, it was to understand what effect the display of industrial might had on the enemy's psyche. "May I ask a question, General?" Weller ventured. "Go ahead, Captain. Was this intentional? Bringing us here to witness this?" The general smiled slightly. "You mean, is this psychological warfare?" "Partly. But mostly it's practical. You have skills we can use, and showing you the reality of our production capacity serves a dual purpose. You understand the futility of continued German resistance, and that understanding will eventually filter back to Germany when you're repatriated." He gestured toward the endless rows of vehicles. "This isn't even our main effort, Captain. This is one harbor of dozens. America's true production capacity isn't visible here. It's in Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles. What you're seeing is just the delivery system." That evening, Weller shared the conversation with his fellow prisoners. The general's frank assessment confirmed what they had calculated themselves over the past weeks, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by someone at the heart of American logistics planning gave it a finality that their own conclusions had lacked. He spoke as if their victory was a foregone conclusion, Weller explained, not with arrogance, but with the certainty of someone reading a mathematical proof. "And it is mathematics," Arndt said bitterly. "The same calculations we've been making. When you can build 10 tanks for every one your enemy produces, tactics become irrelevant. Courage becomes irrelevant. Everything becomes irrelevant except production capacity." The youngest prisoner, Müller, shook his head in disbelief. "But we've fought for 5 years. We've won battles, conquered nations. How could we have come so far if defeat was certain from the start?" Klemperer, who had remained silent during most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Because we were fighting different enemies at different times. Against Poland, France, even Britain alone, our industrial capacity was sufficient. But the moment America entered the war," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "The mathematics changed," Weller concluded for him. The next morning brought news that shook even their newly calibrated understanding of American capabilities. Barnes arrived at the barracks with fresh orders. "New assignment today," he announced. "They're bringing in prefabricated port sections for expansion. You'll be helping with the installation." "Expansion?" Weller asked, puzzled. "The harbour is already handling more tonnage than any port in Europe." Barnes nodded. "That's right. But it's not enough. We're doubling capacity over the next 2 weeks." The German prisoners exchanged glances of disbelief. The harbour they had been witnessing the operation that had already shattered their understanding of possible logistics scale was considered insufficient by American planners. When they arrived at the designated section, they found an American engineering battalion preparing to install massive prefabricated dock sections. These weren't hasty field expedients or temporary structures. They were complete port facilities, concrete and steel constructions, weighing hundreds of tons, built entirely in America, transported across the Atlantic on specialized vessels, and designed to be installed and operational within days. The engineering officer in charge, a Major Hansen, briefed their work detail on the installation process. His casual confidence in handling components of such massive scale was itself revealing. This wasn't an exceptional engineering feat to him, it was routine American practice. "These sections come from the Philadelphia Navy Yard," he explained, pointing to the manufacturer's stamp on one massive piece. "They build 4 complete port sections per week there. The bottleneck isn't production, it's shipping capacity to get them across the Atlantic." Weller studied the engineering diagrams with professional interest. The modular design was brilliant in its simplicity. Each section was self-contained, with built-in utility connections, structural reinforcements, and standardized joining mechanisms. They could be assembled in multiple configurations depending on the coastal geography and operational needs. "How many of these modular ports has America deployed?" he asked. Major Hansen considered the question. "In the European theatre, 17 operational, another 12 under construction. similar numbers in the Pacific. The implications were staggering. America wasn't just supplying the war effort through existing infrastructure, they were creating new infrastructure as needed. Manufacturing entire ports like automobile parts, deploying them anywhere coastal geography permitted. For Weller, this revelation completed the picture that had been forming since his first day at the harbor. American industrial dominance wasn't limited to weapons, ammunition, or vehicles. It extended to the very infrastructure of war itself. They could fabricate, transport, and install entire logistical systems wherever they were needed. That evening, a rare package of mail arrived for the prisoners, letters from Germany that had made their way through the International Red Cross. The men fell upon this connection to home with desperate eagerness, but the contents brought little comfort. The letters, heavily censored both by German and Allied authorities, contained mostly personal notes from family members. But reading between the lines, the prisoners could discern the deteriorating situation at home. References to difficult times, scarcity of basic goods, and hoping for better days painted a picture of a Germany suffering under increasingly severe shortages. Most revealing were the things not mentioned. No one wrote about military successes or confidence in final victory phrases that had been mandatory in earlier correspondence. The absence of these required patriotic expressions spoke volumes about collapsing morale on the home front. Arndt received a letter from a naval colleague who had been repatriated in a prisoner exchange. One paragraph, surviving the censors perhaps through oversight, contained a devastating assessment. The Reich is emptying its reserves. Boys of 16 and men of 60 are being called up. Factories operate under constant air raid alerts. The eastern provinces are being evacuated. No one speaks of victory anymore, only of survival. The letter confirmed what the prisoners had already calculated. Germany was approaching complete industrial exhaustion. While American factories operated around the clock without fear of bombing, German production diminished daily under Allied air attacks. While American logistics flowed in ever-increasing volume, German supply lines contracted and fragmented. Later that night, Weller found himself unable to sleep. The combined weight of what they had witnessed at the harbor and what they had gleaned from the letters created an unbearable cognitive dissonance. The contrast between American abundance and German desperation was too stark to process. He slipped outside, nodding to the American guard who monitored their barracks with casual professionalism. The night was clear and cold. The harbor spread before him like a galaxy of activity, lights and movement continuing without pause despite the late hour. Barnes found him there an hour later, still watching the ceaseless flow of men and materials. "Couldn't sleep?" the lieutenant asked, offering a cigarette. Weller accepted with a nod of thanks. "The letters from home, they make it clear that Germany is approaching collapse. Yet our leadership continues to speak of miracle weapons and final victory. Denial is a powerful force," Barnes replied, "especially when the alternative is accepting complete defeat. But at what cost? How many more will die for a war that production statistics decided years ago?" Barnes had no answer. The two men smoked, as in silence, watching the harbor's eternal rhythm of unloading, processing, and dispatching the mechanical heartbeat of American logistics that would continue until Germany's final surrender. The following week brought them face to face with perhaps the most symbolic representation of American industrial philosophy, the field repair depot. Here, damaged vehicles and equipment were assessed, categorized, and either repaired or salvaged for parts with assembly line efficiency. What struck Weller most was the decision-making process. American technicians used standardized assessment forms with simple criteria. If repairs would require more than a specified number of man-hours or percentage of replacement parts, the equipment was declared a total loss and sent to salvage. Vehicles that German mechanics would have labored over for weeks, carefully rebuilding with hand-fitted parts and improvised solutions, were casually condemned because replacement was more efficient than repair. It wasn't wasteful in the American calculus, it was mathematically optimal. Why spend 50 man-hours repairing a Jeep when those same workers could process a dozen newly arrived vehicles in the same time? In the Wehrmacht, Weller explained to the American workshop supervisor, we had specialized repair units that could rebuild engines from fragments, fabricate replacement parts by hand, and keep vehicles operational long past their intended service life. Impressive craftsmanship, the supervisor acknowledged. But terrible economics. We measure efficiency differently. Time is our most precious resource. If replacing is faster than repairing, we replace. This philosophy extended beyond vehicles to weapons, equipment, even clothing. American soldiers received new uniforms when old ones showed significant wear. German soldiers mended and patched until fabric could take no more stitches. American machine guns were replaced at the first sign of significant wear. German weapons were used until they failed completely, then rebuilt. The contrast reflected fundamentally different industrial realities. Germany operated from scarcity, extracting maximum use from every resource. America operated from abundance, optimizing for time and operational effectiveness rather than material conservation. One morning in late December, the prisoners were assigned to help inventory a newly arrived shipment of medical supplies. The volume was overwhelming: crates of penicillin, plasma, surgical equipment, bandages, and medications in quantities that could supply a major hospital for months. All this for a single field medical battalion supporting one division. Arndt, examining the shipping manifests, made a discovery that left him silent and shaken. "What is it?" Weller asked, noticing his friend's expression. Arndt handed him the manifest. "Look at the production dates." Weller scanned the document and understood immediately. The medical supplies, the antibiotics, plasma, even the complex surgical instruments had been manufactured within the previous 30 days. This wasn't old stock being shipped forward. This was fresh production, created specifically for this shipment, delivered through a supply chain of breathtaking efficiency. "They're not drawing down existing supplies," Arndt said quietly. "They're producing all this new, continuously. The factories haven't stopped." This realization added a new dimension to their understanding of American industrial capacity. It wasn't just about the total volume of production, it was about the sustainability of that production. American factories weren't making a final, desperate push that would exhaust their resources. They were operating at a pace they could maintain indefinitely. As Christmas approached, the American command made surprising accommodations for their prisoners' religious and cultural traditions. They were granted Christmas Eve off from work details, provided with modest but special rations, even allowed to hold a service led by a fellow prisoner who had been a Lutheran minister before the war. This unexpected humanity prompted reflection among the prisoners. They had been treated with consistent correctness since capture, fed adequately, housed in reasonable conditions, given medical care when needed. The contrast with stories they had heard about Soviet treatment of German prisoners was stark. "They can afford to be humane," Klemperer observed. "Their victory is so certain that they're already thinking about the peace, about rebuilding Germany as part of their new world order. Is that so terrible?" Müller asked. The young soldier had undergone the most profound transformation since their arrival at the harbour. His initial patriotic defiance had given way to a pragmatic reassessment. If they rebuild Germany with even a fraction of what they've built here? No one answered, but his implication hung in the air. Perhaps defeat by such an overwhelmingly productive society might ultimately prove better than victory under a regime that had led Germany into a war it could never win. Christmas Day brought another revelation, one that completed their education in American logistics. Lieutenant Barnes arrived at their barracks with news. "You're being reassigned," he announced. "New harbour being constructed 50 miles up the coast. They need your technical skills there." "Another harbour?" Weller asked. "Of this same scale?" "Bigger," Barnes replied. "This one's primarily for military supplies. The new one will handle civil reconstruction materials, building supplies, infrastructure components, agricultural equipment." The implication stunned them. Even as the war continued with brutal intensity on the German frontier, America was already shipping materials for rebuilding Europe. The same industrial machine that had produced the tools of Germany's defeat was already pivoting to produce the tools of Europe's reconstruction. "They're not waiting for the war to end," Klemperer realized. "They're already building what comes after." Before their transfer, General Somerville made another appearance at the harbour. This time, he specifically requested to speak with the German officers among the prisoners. Weller, Klemperer, and Arndt were brought to a small conference room in the administrative building. The general dispensed with formalities. "Gentlemen, you've had nearly 3 months to observe our operations here. As professional military officers with technical backgrounds, I'm interested in your assessment." The 3 Germans exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to this unusual request. Finally, Weller spoke for the group. "General, what we've witnessed here has completely transformed our understanding of American industrial capacity. The scale exceeds anything we believed possible. The efficiency of your logistics system, the standardization of equipment, the sheer volume of material flow, it represents a different paradigm of warfare than what we were trained to conduct." Somerville nodded. "And your conclusions about the strategic implications?" Weller hesitated only briefly. What was the point in diplomatic evasion now? That Germany's defeat is mathematically inevitable, that it has been inevitable since America's entry into the war. That continued resistance represents needless suffering. And would you be willing to communicate that assessment to German officers still fighting? The question hung in the air, fraught with implications of collaboration. Yet Weller recognized that the general wasn't asking them to betray Germany. He was asking them to help save German lives by acknowledging a reality that production statistics had already determined. "We would," Weller answered quietly, "because it's the truth, and because every day of continued fighting only increases the suffering of the German people without changing the ultimate outcome." Somerville studied them for a moment, then nodded. "You'll be transferred tomorrow to the new harbour operation. There, you'll encounter other German POWs with technical backgrounds. Share what you've learned here. Help them understand what you now understand." As they prepared for transfer the following morning, packing their few possessions, Weller found himself contemplating how profoundly his perspective had changed since that first day when the truck had rounded the bend, revealing the harbour's immensity. He had arrived as a captured enemy, still believing in some possibility, however remote, of German victory. He departed as someone who understood with mathematical certainty the inevitability of Germany's defeat, not through any failure of German courage or skill, but through the implacable reality of industrial production. "What will you tell the other prisoners?" Barnes asked as they loaded into the transport trucks. "At the new installation?" "The truth," Weller replied simply, "that we witnessed American industrial capacity that made Germany's defeat inevitable, that continued resistance only prolongs suffering without changing the outcome, that the same industrial might that defeated Germany can rebuild it if we accept reality and prepare for what comes after." Barnes nodded. "That's why General Somerville wanted you transferred. You're not just POWs anymore, you're witnesses. You've seen the mathematical reality of modern industrial warfare. Your testimony carries weight that American propaganda never could." As their truck pulled away from Port-en-Bessin, Weller took a final look at the harbour that had transformed his understanding of modern warfare. The endless procession of ships, the mountains of supplies, the ceaseless activity all continued without pause. The industrial heartbeat of Allied victory. The tears shed by German POWs when they first witnessed this abundance had not been merely for their own defeat. They had wept for the futility of a struggle against overwhelming industrial superiority. They had wept for comrades still fighting a war that production statistics had already decided. They had wept for the mathematical certainty that courage, tactical brilliance, and fighting spirit qualities they had been taught to revere meant nothing against the unstoppable tide of American factory output. But in that bitter knowledge, Weller now recognized, lay the seeds of a different future. The same American industrial might that had built Liberty ships and Sherman tanks by the thousands could build bridges, factories, and homes with equal efficiency. The same logistical genius that had moved mountains of supplies across the Atlantic could move food to hungry populations, medicine to the sick, building materials to shattered cities. The road to the new harbour took them through countryside already showing signs of this transition. American engineering units were rebuilding bridges destroyed during the fighting. Civil affairs teams distributed food to local villages. Construction crews erected prefabricated buildings to replace bombed structures. Even before victory was complete, the great industrial machine was shifting focus from destruction to construction. Their truck crested a hill, and the new harbour came into view. Like its predecessor at Port-en-Bessin, it stretched for miles along the coast, a testament to American engineering and industrial capacity. But this installation had a different character. Instead of ammunition and tanks, the docks were receiving lumber, cement, agricultural equipment, and electrical components. Rebuilding supplies, the driver explained, noticing their interest. For when we push into Germany, the generals figured out that the best way to keep captured territory is to rebuild it immediately, show people a better future. The new POW camp was adjacent to the harbour, similar to their previous accommodation but larger, housing perhaps 200 German prisoners. As their truck pulled through the gates, Weller could see groups of men working throughout the facility, assisting with various aspects of the harbour's operation. Their arrival created immediate interest. As former officers with experience from the Port-en-Bessin operation, they were something of a novelty. That evening, in the camp's mess hall, they found themselves surrounded by curious fellow prisoners, eager for news and perspective. "Is it true?" one engineer asked Weller. "The scale of their production? We've heard rumours." "Whatever you've heard," Weller replied, "multiply it by 5, and then perhaps you'll approach the reality." Over the following days, Weller and his companions found themselves serving as unofficial educators, explaining what they had witnessed and what it meant for Germany's future. Some prisoners rejected their assessment as defeatism or propaganda. Others listened with growing comprehension and, ultimately, acceptance. A former Luftwaffe officer challenged Weller most aggressively. "You speak of American production as if it makes our defeat inevitable. But what of German engineering superiority? Our Me-262 jets, our V-weapons. Our technology is years ahead of theirs." Weller nodded patiently. "Our engineering is excellent. The Me-262 is indeed superior to any Allied fighter, but America produces conventional fighters at a rate of 15-1 compared to our jet production. Quality becomes irrelevant against such quantity." "And their quality is not poor," Arndt added. "Their equipment is well designed for mass production, for ease of maintenance, for operational reliability. They sacrifice some performance for standardization and ease of manufacture, but those trade-offs enable their overwhelming production advantage." As January 1945 unfolded, news reached them of the Soviet offensive, sweeping westward, and of Allied forces pressing into Germany itself. The reports, filtered through American newspapers and occasional wireless broadcasts, painted a picture of collapsing German resistance on all fronts. Yet what struck Weller most about these reports was their matter-of-fact tone. American media discussed victory not as a hope or possibility, but as a mathematical certainty, exactly the conclusion he had reached through his observations at the harbour. The only questions involved timelines and costs, not the ultimate outcome. One February morning, an American colonel arrived at the camp seeking Weller specifically. He was escorted to an office where the colonel waited with a civilian in an expensive suit. "Captain Weller," the colonel began without preamble, "this is Dr. Marshall from the Economic Recovery Planning Office. He has some questions about German industrial infrastructure." Weller was immediately wary. "Colonel, as a prisoner of war, I cannot provide information that might be used against Germany." The civilian smiled. "Captain, we're not gathering intelligence for military purposes. We're planning the economic reconstruction of Europe, including Germany. My office is tasked with developing plans for rebuilding German industry after the war ends." The conversation that followed was surreal. The American asked detailed questions about German factory layouts, technical education systems, transportation networks, not to target them for destruction, but to plan their rehabilitation. They discussed which industries could be quickly converted to civilian production, which population centers would need immediate attention, how technical expertise could be preserved and redirected. You're planning this reconstruction before the war is even over? Weller asked, amazed at the foresight. Of course, Dr. Marshall replied. The same productive capacity that's winning the war will rebuild Europe afterward. We're already shifting focus. Military production is actually declining in some sectors because we have sufficient stockpiles. Factories are beginning to convert back to civilian goods. This revelation completed Weller's education in American industrial might. Not only could they outproduce Germany by factors of 5-to-1 in military equipment, but they could begin transitioning to peace production before the war had even ended. The margin of superiority was so great that they could afford to look beyond victory to the peace that would follow. As spring approached, bringing with it news of Allied forces crossing the Rhine and Soviet armies pushing toward Berlin, Weller found himself increasingly focused on Germany's future rather than its present defeat. The mathematical certainty of American industrial superiority that had once brought him to tears now offered a strange comfort. The same productive capacity that had ensured Germany's defeat could ensure its resurrection. One evening in late March, Lieutenant Barnes, now Captain Barnes following a promotion, arrived at the camp with unprecedented news. "You're being repatriated," he announced to Weller's group, "part of a new program for technical specialists. You'll be returned to Germany to assist with maintaining essential civilian infrastructure as Allied forces advance." The announcement stunned them. Repatriation before the war's end was almost unheard of for POWs. "Why?" Arndt asked suspiciously. "Why would you send us back now?" "Because you understand what most Germans don't yet grasp," Barnes explained. "You've witnessed American production capability firsthand. You know the war is mathematically lost for Germany, and you can help prevent needless final destruction by explaining this reality to those still fighting a lost cause." The realization dawned on Weller with sudden clarity. They weren't being repatriated despite their knowledge of American industrial might. They were being repatriated because of it. They had become witnesses to a reality that German leadership had denied for years. Their value now lay not in their technical skills, but in their testimony. They could speak with the authority of those who had seen with their own eyes the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat and the equally certain promise of American-led reconstruction. 2 weeks later, Weller found himself on a transport aircraft flying toward Switzerland, part of a prisoner exchange arranged through the International Red Cross. From there, they would be transported to Germany itself, what remained of it, as Allied forces pushed toward final victory. As the plane carried them eastward, Weller thought of that first day at Port-en-Bessin, when he and his fellow prisoners had wept at the sight of 5 million tons of supplies flowing through a single harbour. They had not wept merely from defeat or humiliation. They had wept from the clarity that came with understanding the fundamental truth of modern industrial warfare. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or its officers lacked skill. It had lost because factories matter more than foxholes, production lines more than front lines. The mathematical reality of 5-to-1 production advantages had determined the outcome long before tactical engagements could matter. Yet, in that bitter knowledge lay hope for the future. The same American ability to build Liberty ships and Sherman tanks could build apartment blocks and power plants. The same logistical genius that had moved mountains of supplies for destruction could move materials for construction. As their aircraft began its descent toward the Swiss border, Weller made a silent promise to himself. He would tell the truth to anyone who would listen, not just about the harbours and the supply dumps and the endless streams of material that had made Germany's defeat inevitable, but about what came after, about how the greatest industrial machine ever created was already pivoting from war to peace, from destruction to construction. The tears shed by German POWs when they witnessed American abundance had marked an end, the end of one understanding of the warfare, of one vision of Germany's future. But they also marked a beginning, the beginning of comprehension that the same industrial might that had defeated Germany could rebuild it. That understanding, born in the shock of seeing 5 million tons of ships unloading in a single harbour, might yet prove the salvation of a defeated nation. If Germany could accept the mathematical reality of industrial warfare, if it could recognize that the future belonged not to ideological fervor or martial spirit, but to productive capacity and technical innovation, then perhaps defeat could become the foundation for a different and better future. The plane touched down on Swiss soil. Through the window, Weller could see the snow-capped Alps gleaming in the spring sunshine. Beyond them lay Germany defeated, broken, facing an uncertain future. But he carried with him knowledge that transcended defeat. The understanding that industrial capacity that could destroy with unprecedented efficiency could also build with equal effectiveness. In that knowledge lay the seeds of renewal, of reconstruction, of a future where tears would be shed not for the mathematical certainty of defeat, but for the equally certain promise of rebirth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.